The first crack of trouble arrived with the smell of fresh coffee and rain-soaked pavement. It was a quiet Saturday morning in a small town outside Louisville, Kentucky. The streets were still waking up. Shop owners unlocked their doors. Church bells echoed faintly across the historic district. Most people expected an ordinary day. Nobody expected a moment that would change the town forever. Marcus Reed parked his rental sedan beside an old brick sidewalk and stepped into a local coffee shop called Maple House Cafe. At 48 years old, Marcus carried himself with calm confidence. He wore a brown leather jacket, dark jeans, and reading glasses hanging from his collar. He looked like a man enjoying a peaceful weekend away from work. That was exactly what he wanted everyone to believe. Marcus had come to Kentucky for personal reasons. His late mother had grown up nearby. After her passing the previous year, he found himself missing her more than expected. The trip was supposed to help him reconnect with family memories. He planned to visit old neighborhoods, walk country roads she once described, and spend time reflecting on everything life had taken and given. Inside the cafe, warm light spilled across polished wooden floors. The smell of cinnamon pastries mixed with fresh espresso. A young cashier named Emily Carter greeted him with a smile. Marcus ordered black coffee and a blueberry scone. He thanked her politely and settled into a booth near the front window. As he unfolded the morning newspaper, he felt something familiar. Eyes, people watching him. It was subtle at first. A glance from an older customer, a whisper from a nearby table. Nothing unusual for a black man entering a place where he clearly stood out. Marcus had experienced that feeling before. Most times he ignored it. Today seemed no different. What nobody inside the cafe knew was that Marcus Reed was one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the United States. From his office in Washington, D.C., he had spent 20 years fighting discrimination cases, exposing corruption, and representing victims whose voices had been ignored. His name regularly appeared in legal journals and federal court records. Yet here he was, alone, drinking coffee and reading sports headlines. Across the room sat Evelyn Whitmore, a retired school administrator in her late 60s. She watched Marcus carefully over the rim of her teacup. Her family had lived in the town for generations. She believed deeply in tradition, order, and preserving the community exactly as it had always been. New faces made her uncomfortable. Different faces made her suspicious. The bell above the cafe door rang again. Officer Brandon Hayes stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, and proud of the authority attached to his badge, Hayes was one of those officers who enjoyed being recognized. Several customers greeted him immediately. He barely acknowledged them. His attention locked onto Marcus within seconds. The atmosphere shifted. Marcus noticed it without lifting his eyes from the newspaper. Years of courtroom battles had taught him how quickly tension could enter a room. He heard the officers' boots crossing the floor. He felt conversations growing quieter. Officer Hayes stopped beside the booth. "Morning," Marcus said calmly. The officer did not return the greeting. Instead, he studied Marcus with open suspicion. "You from around here?" Hayes asked. Marcus folded one corner of his newspaper. "Just visiting." "Visiting who?" The question carried a sharp edge. Marcus looked up. "Is there a reason you're asking?" Several customers glanced toward the booth. Officer Hayes rested one hand on his duty belt. "Maybe there is. Maybe there isn't." Marcus felt something tighten inside his chest. Not fear, recognition. He had heard this tone before. He had represented people whose lives changed after hearing that exact tone. Across the room, Evelyn Whitmore slowly nodded toward the officer. The gesture lasted less than a second. But Marcus saw it. So did Emily behind the counter. Outside, grey clouds gathered over the town square. A distant roll of thunder echoed beyond the courthouse dome. Inside Maple House Cafe, a quiet morning was beginning to unravel, and neither Officer Brandon Hayes nor anyone else in that room realized that the man sitting calmly beside the window had spent his entire career preparing for a moment exactly like this. Officer Brandon Hayes remained beside the booth, towering over Marcus Reed as though the cafe belonged to him. The room had grown noticeably quieter. Even the television mounted above the counter seemed distant now. Marcus folded his newspaper carefully and placed it beside his coffee. "Can I help you with something, officer?" Marcus asked. Hayes crossed his arms. I received a report about someone acting suspicious. And what exactly qualifies as suspicious? The officer's jaw tightened. You tell me. Marcus leaned back slightly. Reading a newspaper, drinking coffee, visiting my mother's hometown. Several customers shifted uncomfortably. Emily Carter felt her stomach sink. She had worked at Maple House Cafe for 3 years and knew the difference between routine police work and something else. This felt like something else. Hayes ignored Marcus's question. Let me see some identification. Marcus remained calm. Am I being accused of a crime? Just show me your ID. Am I legally required to? The silence that followed stretched across the entire cafe. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. Officer Hayes glanced around the room, aware that people were watching. His pride was now involved. What had started as curiosity was becoming a challenge to his authority. You know, Hayes said, most people cooperate when asked. Marcus nodded slowly. Most officers explain why they're asking. The response drew a nervous cough from an elderly man near the door. Hayes took a step closer. You think you're smart? I think the Constitution matters. That answer landed harder than Marcus intended. Across the room, Evelyn Whitmore suddenly spoke. Officer, I've been watching him since he arrived. Every head turned toward her. And? Hayes asked. Evelyn straightened in her chair. He hasn't spoken to anybody. He keeps watching people through that window. Marcus blinked. I've been reading a newspaper. That's not what it looked like, Evelyn replied. The accusation hung in the air. Marcus recognized the strategy immediately. He had seen it in courtrooms for years. Someone creates suspicion. Another person confirms it. Soon assumption becomes accepted truth. Officer Hayes nodded as if Evelyn had provided critical evidence. See, concerned citizen. Marcus sighed quietly. Concern isn't evidence. Hayes grabbed the radio attached to his shoulder. Dispatch, this is Hayes. Need verification on that suspicious person report from earlier. The radio crackled. A vague response came back. Marcus listened carefully. There was no mention of a crime, no victim, no suspect description, nothing specific whatsoever. Yet Hayes smiled as though he had just received confirmation. Description matches, he announced. Marcus looked directly into the officer's eyes. What description? Hayes hesitated. Male, medium build. That's half the state of Kentucky. A few customers looked away. The officer's face reddened. Marcus noticed Emily discreetly holding her phone beneath the counter. The small red recording light was visible. Smart, he thought. Very smart. Stand up, Hayes ordered. No. The answer was calm, simple, direct. The room froze. Hayes stared at him. What did you say? I said no. Marcus folded his hands on the table. I have committed no crime. I am sitting in a public business. I purchased food and coffee. If you believe I violated a law, tell me which one. Otherwise, leave me alone. The words were measured and professional, that somehow made Hayes even angrier. People expected arguments. They expected raised voices. Marcus offered neither. Outside, rain intensified. Thunder rolled closer. Hayes pressed his radio again, requesting backup. Emily nearly dropped her phone. Backup? For what? An older couple exchanged worried glances. A young mother quietly moved her daughter farther from the confrontation. Marcus remained seated. Inside, however, his thoughts were moving rapidly. He knew exactly where this path could lead. He knew the statistics. He knew the stories. He knew the consequences. Most importantly, he knew that revealing who he really was would end everything immediately. One sentence could stop the entire situation. One sentence could save everyone involved. But Marcus found himself wondering something deeper. If he revealed his identity now, what would happen to the next man who sat in this booth without power, status, or influence? That question settled heavily in his mind. Across the cafe, Evelyn Whitmore quietly pulled out her phone. She began dialing a number she knew by heart. The call connected almost immediately. Hello? A man's voice answered. Evelyn lowered her voice. David, she said, you need to come down here right now. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation, but he noticed her smile, and for the first time that morning, he sensed that this situation was about to become far bigger than one officer with a badge. The rain continued falling over the town square as tension settled inside Maple House Cafe like a heavy blanket. Nobody was eating anymore. Nobody was focused on coffee or conversation. Every eye drifted toward the confrontation near the front window. Marcus Reed remained seated. Officer Brandon Hayes stood over him. Neither man moved. The silence itself had become a contest. Hayes hated it. He was accustomed to compliance. Most people became nervous when confronted by authority. Most people apologized, explained themselves, or simply obeyed. Marcus was doing none of those things. He was calm. Calmness felt like defiance. The officer checked his watch. Backup would arrive soon. That thought restored some confidence. "Last chance," Hayes said. "Stand up and identify yourself." Marcus looked out the window briefly. Rainwater streamed down the glass. "Officer, you're creating a problem that doesn't exist. You're refusing lawful instructions." "You haven't given any lawful instructions." The answer struck a nerve. Hayes slammed his palm against the table. Several customers jumped. Emily Carter gasped behind the counter. The officer leaned closer. "You think you can come into this town and tell me how to do my job?" Marcus met his stare. "No, I think you're demonstrating exactly how you do your job." The words landed like a punch. Across the room, Evelyn Whitmore smiled slightly. She had finished her phone call several minutes earlier. Now she waited. Marcus noticed her expression. Waiting. Expecting. Certain help was coming. That realization concerned him more than Hayes, because problems rarely grow larger without support. The bell above the cafe door rang. A second officer entered, Deputy Ryan Cooper. Younger than Hayes, leaner, less confident, he immediately sensed something unusual. "What's going on?" Cooper asked. "Uncooperative subject," Hayes replied. "Subject?" "Refusing identification." Cooper glanced at Marcus. Marcus gave a polite nod. The deputy returned it automatically. For a brief second, uncertainty crossed his face. Marcus saw it. This younger officer wasn't entirely comfortable. Not yet, anyway. Hayes quickly filled the silence. Possible connection to a suspicious activity report. "What report?" Cooper asked. The question hung awkwardly. Hayes hesitated, just long enough. Marcus noticed. So did Cooper. "Dispatch mentioned it earlier," Hayes said. The explanation sounded weak. Cooper's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew the dispatch logs. He had worked the morning shift. He couldn't remember any such report. Still, he said nothing. That silence disappointed Marcus, not because he expected heroics, because he recognized a familiar pattern. Good people often stay quiet when courage becomes expensive. Outside, a black SUV rolled slowly through the intersection before continuing down the street. Marcus barely noticed it. Inside the cafe, the situation continued escalating. "Stand up," Hayes ordered again. Marcus remained seated. "No." The single word changed everything. Hayes grabbed Marcus by the shoulder. Gasps erupted throughout the cafe. Emily nearly dropped her phone. Marcus immediately raised both hands into view. "Do not touch me again," he said calmly. "I'll touch whoever I need to touch." "Then explain your legal authority." "I don't owe you explanations." "Actually, you do." The room fell silent again. Marcus's voice never rose. That steady composure somehow made Hayes look worse with every passing minute. The officer pulled handcuffs from his belt. Metal clicked loudly. A young child near the back began crying. Her mother quickly gathered her belongings. People were starting to leave. Nobody wanted involvement. Nobody wanted attention. Marcus understood. Fear was powerful. Fear always had been. "You're being detained," Hayes announced. "For what crime?" "Obstruction," Marcus almost laughed. "Obstruction of what?" Hayes didn't answer, because there was no answer. Deputy Cooper shifted uncomfortably. His instincts told him something was wrong, very wrong, yet he still remained silent. Marcus slowly stood from the booth, not because he agreed, not because he was intimidated, because he understood how quickly unnecessary force could appear in situations like this. He placed both hands where everyone could see them. "I am not resisting," Marcus said. "Good choice," Hayes replied. The officer immediately began searching his pockets. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. There it was. The line had officially been crossed. Wallet, phone, keys, everything landed on the table. Hayes opened the wallet. He searched aggressively, looking for evidence, looking for justification, looking for anything that could prove his assumptions correct. Instead, he found something else, a thick stack of business cards. He tossed them aside without reading them. Marcus watched quietly. One glance. That was all it would have taken. One glance could have ended everything. But Hayes never looked, because he wasn't searching for truth anymore. He was searching for confirmation, and confirmation is blind. Outside, another vehicle turned onto Main Street. This one stopped directly in front of the cafe. The driver stepped out, a tall man in a dark overcoat, grey hair, confident posture. People inside immediately recognized him. The room grew even quieter. Because the man approaching the cafe wasn't just another officer, he was Police Commissioner David Whitmore, and he also happened to be Evelyn Whitmore's husband. The moment Police Commissioner David Whitmore stepped through the cafe door, the atmosphere changed again. Conversations stopped. Customers straightened in their seats. Even Officer Brandon Hayes appeared relieved. Authority had arrived. Whitmore was 63 years old and carried the reputation of a man who had spent decades controlling outcomes. His silver hair was neatly combed. His dark overcoat looked expensive. His expression suggested absolute confidence in his own judgment. He immediately spotted his wife. Evelyn gave him a small nod. Then she glanced toward Marcus Reed. The message required no words. Whitmore understood exactly what she meant. He walked directly toward the confrontation. "What's happening here?" he asked. Hayes quickly stepped forward. "Suspicious individual refusing cooperation, sir." Marcus almost smiled. The description had somehow become even more vague. Whitmore turned toward him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The commissioner studied Marcus carefully. Marcus studied him right back. Years of courtroom experience had taught Marcus how to read people. David Whitmore wasn't evaluating facts. He was evaluating appearance, making assumptions, drawing conclusions. The decision had already been made. The conversation was simply a formality. "Your name?" Whitmore asked. Marcus remained standing beside the table. "I have not committed any crime. That wasn't my question. And my answer remains the same." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. The response irritated him, not because it was disrespectful, because it denied him control. Across the cafe, Emily Carter continued recording. Her hands trembled. She understood instinctively that something important was unfolding, something people might later deny. Video didn't forget. Marcus noticed her courage. He hoped she realized how important it was. "Officer Hayes tells me you've been uncooperative," Whitmore said. "Officer Hayes has yet to explain why I'm being detained. He doesn't need your permission to investigate suspicious behavior." Marcus nodded slowly. "Suspicion requires facts." Whitmore folded his arms. "We decide what qualifies as suspicious in this town." The statement landed heavily. Several customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even Deputy Ryan Cooper looked down at the floor. Marcus felt disappointment settle deeper inside him. Not anger, disappointment. The commissioner had just said the quiet part out loud, and he didn't even realize it. Outside, rain hammered harder against the windows. Thunder rattled the glass. Inside, the storm continued building. "Commissioner," Marcus said carefully, "I would strongly encourage you to reconsider this situation before it goes further." Whitmore laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Marcus maintained eye contact. "I'm warning you." That answer ignited something. Hayes visibly stiffened. Whitmore's expression darkened. The younger officers exchanged nervous looks. The room suddenly felt smaller. Marcus knew exactly how dangerous wounded pride could become, particularly when paired with authority. Whitmore stepped closer. "You think you're important?" Marcus said nothing. "You think rules don't apply to you?" Still nothing. Whitmore turned toward Hayes. "Have you searched him?" "Yes, sir." "Anything suspicious?" "Not yet." Marcus noticed the wording. "Not yet," as though evidence simply needed more time to appear. The commissioner glanced at the items scattered across the table. Wallet, phone, keys, business cards. The stack of cards sat inches from his hand. Again, one glance would have changed everything. Again, nobody bothered to look. Confirmation blindness had become contagious. Whitmore looked back at Marcus. "Put him in cuffs." The words echoed through the cafe. Emily gasped. An older woman covered her mouth. Deputy Cooper froze. For a brief moment, Marcus thought the younger officer might object, might speak, might intervene. Instead, Cooper remained silent. The silence hurt more than hostility. Hayes immediately grabbed Marcus's wrists. The handcuffs clicked shut. Too tight, deliberately tight. Pain shot through Marcus's hands. He didn't react. He had represented countless clients who described exactly this experience. Now he was living it. Whitmore appeared satisfied. Evelyn smiled from across the room. Marcus noticed that too. Neither expression surprised him. What surprised him was everyone else. The ordinary people, the witnesses, the people staring at their tables, the people avoiding eye contact, the people saying nothing. History rarely moved because of villains alone. It moved because ordinary people convinced themselves silence was safer. Hayes began leading Marcus toward the door. The bell rang as they stepped outside. Cold rain struck Marcus's face. The patrol vehicle waited at the curb. Whitmore followed behind with the confidence of a man who believed the matter was already settled. Marcus glanced once toward the grey Kentucky sky, then toward the town square, then toward the street beyond. And for the first time that morning, he noticed 3 black SUVs turning slowly onto Main Street several blocks away. They were still distant, still barely visible through the rain. But Marcus recognized the vehicles immediately. He said nothing. Instead, he allowed the officers to place him inside the patrol car. Then he quietly smiled, because someone was already coming. Rainwater streamed down the patrol car windows as Marcus Reed sat quietly in the back seat. The metal handcuffs pressed against his wrists. Outside, Officer Brandon Hayes paced near the curb with growing confidence. Commissioner David Whitmore stood beneath the awning of the cafe, speaking with several local officers who had arrived after hearing the radio traffic. Inside Maple House Cafe, nobody seemed capable of returning to normal conversation. Emily Carter continued recording. Her phone battery had dropped below 20%. She didn't care. Something told her every second mattered. Across the room, Evelyn Whitmore sat with an expression of complete satisfaction. In her mind, order had been restored. The outsider had been dealt with. The town had protected itself. What she didn't know was that events had already moved beyond anyone's control. Marcus glanced through the rain-covered window. The 3 black SUVs were closer now, much closer. Meanwhile, Hayes walked over to the patrol car and opened the rear door. "Still feeling confident?" he asked. Marcus looked at him calmly. "Officer, there's still time to stop this." Hayes laughed. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true. You're really committed to this act." Marcus sighed. "What act?" "The educated guy, the innocent guy, the victim." The words hung in the air. Marcus studied him carefully. Years of legal work had taught him something important. Most prejudice wasn't loud at first. It began with assumptions. Those assumptions became beliefs. Those beliefs eventually became actions, and actions changed lives. "Do you know what concerns me most?" Marcus asked. Hayes rolled his eyes. "Here comes the lecture." "No," Marcus shook his head. "What concerns me is how certain you are." The officer frowned. "Certain about what?" "That you can't possibly be wrong." For the first time, Hayes had no response. The conversation ended when one of the newer officers called his name. "Brandon." Hayes turned. "What?" "You should probably see this." The younger officer was holding Marcus's wallet, specifically one of the business cards that had been tossed aside earlier. Hayes felt a sudden chill. The officer approached slowly. "I found this under the table." Hayes grabbed the card. His eyes scanned the printed text, then scanned it again. The color drained from his face. Marcus watched through the window. He recognized the moment instantly. Recognition, doubt, fear. The 3 stages always arrived together. Hayes looked toward the patrol car. Marcus maintained eye contact. Neither man spoke. Then Hayes looked down at the card once more. Marcus Reed, Senior Counsel, National Center for Civil Rights and Constitutional Justice. Washington, D.C. The officer's hand trembled slightly, not because the title itself frightened him, because it suggested something bigger, something he hadn't considered, something dangerous. Commissioner Whitmore noticed the change immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked. Hayes handed him the card. Whitmore glanced at it. His expression remained neutral. So he's a lawyer. A civil rights lawyer, Hayes replied. Whitmore shrugged. That doesn't change anything. But it did. The commissioner simply didn't know it yet. At that exact moment, the three black SUVs pulled to the curb. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. The vehicles parked with precise coordination. Doors opened simultaneously. Men and women stepped out wearing dark suits despite the rain. Not local law enforcement, not state police. Something else. Something federal. Commissioner Whitmore felt his stomach tighten. 8 individuals approached the sidewalk with professional confidence. No urgency, no confusion, no hesitation. The person leading them was a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and a long dark coat. She walked directly toward the patrol vehicle, past Hayes, past Whitmore, past every local officer. She stopped beside the rear passenger door, then she looked directly at Marcus. "Sorry we're late," she said. Marcus smiled. "Traffic?" "Terrible." The woman returned the smile, then she turned toward Commissioner Whitmore. The warmth instantly vanished from her face. She removed a leather credential case from her coat. The gold federal seal flashed beneath the gray afternoon sky. "My name is Rebecca Lawson," she said. "Assistant Director, Civil Rights Enforcement Task Force." The silence became absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Rain continued falling. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the Kentucky hills. Whitmore stared at the badge, then at Marcus, then back at the badge. A terrible realization began forming inside his mind. Assistant Director Lawson's next sentence confirmed every fear. "Commissioner Whitmore," she said quietly, "would you mind explaining why one of the most influential civil rights attorneys in the country is handcuffed in the back of your patrol car?" For several seconds, nobody answered Assistant Director Rebecca Lawson. Rain tapped steadily against the patrol car. Commissioner David Whitmore stared at her federal credentials as though they belonged to another world. Officer Brandon Hayes looked physically ill. The confidence that had carried him through the morning vanished completely. Marcus Reed remained seated in the back of the patrol car. Calm, patient, watching. Lawson turned slightly toward one of the agents standing beside her. "Open the door, please." The agent immediately complied. Marcus stepped out carefully. His wrists were still bound. The red marks left by the handcuffs were impossible to miss. Lawson's eyes narrowed. Who applied these restraints? Nobody spoke. The question hung heavily in the cold afternoon air. Finally, Hayes raised his hand. "I did." Lawson looked at him, not angrily, not emotionally, professionally. That somehow felt worse. An agent removed a small handcuff key and unlocked Marcus's wrists. The metal cuffs dropped into his palm. The sharp clink echoed across the sidewalk. Marcus rubbed his wrists gently. "Thank you," he said. "Are you injured?" Lawson asked. "Nothing serious? Would you like medical documentation?" Marcus glanced toward Hayes. "Yes." The answer landed like another hammer blow, because everyone present understood exactly what medical documentation meant. Evidence, official records, paper trails, consequences. Commissioner Whitmore finally found his voice. "Assistant Director Lawson, I'm sure this entire matter is a misunderstanding." Lawson slowly turned toward him. "A misunderstanding? My officers were investigating suspicious behavior." "What suspicious behavior?" Whitmore hesitated. "Just long enough." Lawson noticed. So did every federal agent standing nearby. "We received a report, Whitmore said. "From who?" No answer. "What crime was reported?" No answer. "What evidence existed before the detention?" Again, no answer. The silence became painful. Inside the cafe, customers watched through the windows. Emily Carter continued recording. She was no longer hiding the phone. There was no point. Everyone understood this had become something historic. Lawson turned to one of her agents. "Collect all available witness statements." "Yes, ma'am." "Secure surveillance footage." "Yes, ma'am." "Preserve every recording made inside that cafe." "Understood." Each instruction tightened the pressure. Marcus watched quietly. Years earlier, he would have felt satisfaction. Today, he mostly felt sadness, because this situation had never needed to happen. Good decisions could have prevented every second of it. Whitmore attempted another approach. "Mr. Reed never identified himself." Lawson looked directly at him. Are citizens required to identify themselves while drinking coffee? Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no good answer. Hayes suddenly spoke. We thought he matched a suspect description. Lawson immediately turned. What description? The officer froze. Male, medium build. Several agents exchanged looks. One actually shook his head. Lawson stared at Hayes. Do you understand how many millions of Americans fit that description? The officer's face reddened. Marcus almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then he remembered the handcuffs, the insults, the assumptions, the humiliation. The sympathy disappeared. A black sedan suddenly pulled up behind the federal vehicles. Another arrival. A man in an expensive suit stepped out carrying a briefcase. Marcus recognized him immediately. Jonathan Pierce, Senior Litigation Counsel for the Civil Rights Enforcement Task Force, one of the sharpest attorneys in the country. Pierce approached quickly. Marcus, Jonathan, you okay? I've had better mornings. The attorney smiled slightly. Then his eyes landed on the red marks around Marcus's wrists. The smile vanished. I see. That single phrase carried enormous weight because lawyers like Jonathan Pierce viewed situations differently. They didn't just see events. They saw evidence, patterns, liability, exposure, risk. Commissioner Whitmore seemed to realize the same thing. For the first time all day, genuine fear appeared on his face. Not fear of Marcus, fear of consequences, fear of records, fear of scrutiny, fear of truth. Lawson looked toward the cafe window. Her attention settled on Emily Carter. The young cashier still held her phone, still recording. Lawson smiled. I believe, she said quietly, that young woman may have just changed this entire case. Inside Maple House Cafe, Emily heard the words through the partially open door. And for the first time since the confrontation began, she realized the video in her hand might become far more important than anyone imagined. By sunset, the story had already begun spreading beyond the boundaries of the small Kentucky town. Federal agents moved through Maple House Cafe with quiet efficiency. Witness statements were collected, security footage was secured, customer interviews were documented. Every detail was preserved before anyone could reconsider what they had seen. Marcus Reed sat inside the cafe once again, in the same booth, at the same table. The half-finished coffee from earlier had long since gone cold. Assistant Director Rebecca Lawson joined him. Outside, flashing emergency lights reflected against rain-soaked pavement. You knew this might happen, Lawson said. Marcus looked through the window. I hoped it wouldn't. But you suspected. He nodded, the moment he walked toward my table. Lawson sighed. Neither of them enjoyed being right about things like this. For 20 years, they had investigated civil rights violations across America. Most cases never reached national headlines. Most victims never had cameras recording. Most stories disappeared before anyone important noticed. This one would be different, because there was evidence, and evidence was difficult to bury. Across town, Commissioner David Whitmore sat inside an interview room at police headquarters. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, he found himself answering questions instead of asking them. The experience felt unnatural, uncomfortable, terrifying. A federal investigator reviewed the timeline, minute by minute, statement by statement, decision by decision. The commissioner quickly discovered that every answer created 2 new problems. Meanwhile, Officer Brandon Hayes occupied another interview room. His confidence had completely collapsed. Hours earlier, he had felt untouchable. Now he sat alone under fluorescent lights, staring at a metal table. His attorney was still driving from Louisville. Federal investigators had already informed him that witness videos existed. Multiple videos. Not just Emily Carter's recording, several customers had quietly filmed portions of the encounter. Hayes realized something devastating. The story was no longer his to control. Back at the cafe, Emily finally lowered her phone. The battery died seconds later. She almost laughed. 12% battery had captured nearly an entire civil rights investigation. One of the federal agents approached her. Miss Carter? Yes? Assistant Director Lawson would like to thank you personally. Emily blinked. For recording? The agent nodded. For refusing to look away. Those words stayed with her, because the truth was she had almost stopped recording several times. She had been scared, scared of upsetting local police, scared of becoming involved, scared of standing alone. Yet she kept pressing record. Now she understood why it mattered. Around 8 o'clock that evening, the first news article appeared online. Then another, then 10 more. By 9 o'clock, regional television stations picked up the story. By 10 o'clock, national outlets began calling federal offices seeking confirmation. Social media exploded. People shared eyewitness accounts, photos, videos, commentary, questions, anger, support. The story spread faster than anyone anticipated. Inside his hotel room, Marcus watched none of it. Instead, he sat quietly near the window overlooking downtown Louisville. A storm still rolled across the city. Lightning flashed beyond the Ohio River. His phone vibrated constantly. Journalists, attorneys, colleagues, friends. He ignored every call. What occupied his thoughts wasn't the media, it wasn't the investigation, it wasn't even the officers. It was the people inside the cafe. The witnesses, the silence, the fear, the hesitation. How many similar moments happened every day across the country? How many ended differently because nobody recorded them? The question lingered. Near midnight, his phone rang again. This time he answered. It was Rebecca Lawson. Her voice sounded unusually serious. "Marcus, we found something." He immediately sat up. "What kind of something?" There was a brief pause. "You need to see this yourself." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. The investigation had only been active for a few hours. Yet Lawson already sounded concerned. Very concerned. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "what did you find?" Another pause, then her answer. This wasn't an isolated incident. Marcus closed his eyes. Deep down, he already knew, but the next sentence hit even harder. "We've identified at least 17 nearly identical complaints connected to the same department." The room suddenly felt colder. Because one unlawful detention was a scandal, 17 similar complaints suggested something far worse. A system. The next morning, Marcus Reed arrived at the federal field office in Louisville before sunrise. A cold mist hung over the city. The streets were quiet. Most residents were just beginning their day. Inside the conference room, however, nobody had slept much. Assistant Director Rebecca Lawson stood beside a wall covered with photographs, reports, timelines, and witness statements. Several investigators were already reviewing files. Coffee cups sat half empty across the table. The atmosphere felt heavy, serious, focused. Marcus entered and immediately noticed the number of folders, far more than 17. "How bad is it?" he asked. Lawson didn't answer immediately. Instead, she handed him a report. Marcus began reading. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Each page revealed the same pattern. Traffic stops without cause, searches without consent, detentions without evidence, complaints dismissed without investigation, body camera footage mysteriously missing, witness accounts ignored. The names changed, the dates changed, the details changed. The pattern remained identical. Marcus slowly placed the report down. "How many?" Lawson folded her arms. 29 confirmed so far." The room fell silent. 29, not one mistake, not one misunderstanding, not one bad day. 29 documented incidents, and investigators were still reviewing records. Marcus looked at the photographs attached to the files. Teachers, veterans, college students, business owners, parents, ordinary people. Many had never met each other, yet their stories sounded remarkably similar. "Who buried the complaints?" Marcus asked. An investigator pointed toward a stack of documents. Almost every complaint passed through Commissioner Whitmore's office. Marcus nodded slowly. That explained a great deal. Systems rarely protect themselves by accident. Someone usually helps, someone usually benefits. Someone usually decides that accountability is inconvenient. Around mid-morning, another discovery emerged. One of the forensic analysts entered carrying a laptop. His expression immediately captured everyone's attention. "We recovered deleted emails," he said. Lawson looked up. "From whose account?" "Whitmore's." The room grew still. The analyst connected the laptop to a projector. A series of emails appeared on the screen. The first few seemed harmless. Administrative updates, scheduling notes, department communications. Then the more troubling messages appeared. Guidance on report wording, suggestions for documenting stops, recommendations on handling citizen complaints. Marcus read each message carefully. The language was cautious, professional, legally aware, yet the intent became obvious. Avoid scrutiny, reduce exposure, control narratives, protect officers. Several investigators exchanged looks. Nobody liked what they were seeing. One particular email caught Marcus's attention. The message had been sent nearly 3 years earlier. It referenced a traffic stop involving a young black teacher. The complaint alleged racial profiling. Whitmore's response was brief. Handle internally. No reason to create unnecessary attention. Marcus stared at the screen. There it was. The philosophy behind everything. Not justice, not accountability. Avoid attention, protect the institution, protect reputations, protect power. The victims came last, if they appeared at all. That afternoon, news coverage intensified. National networks arrived in town, satellite trucks lined Main Street, journalists interviewed residents, community leaders, former officers, local business owners. Public opinion shifted rapidly. People who had remained silent for years began speaking. Former complaints resurfaced. Additional witnesses came forward. Anonymous tips flooded federal offices. The investigation was expanding by the hour. Meanwhile, Commissioner Whitmore's attorney held an emergency press conference. The strategy was predictable: misunderstanding, incomplete facts, rush to judgment, the usual language. The public response was not favorable, because unlike previous controversies, this case contained something powerful: video. People could watch the encounter themselves. They could see the behavior, hear the words, judge the facts. The footage spoke louder than press statements ever could. That evening, Marcus returned to his hotel. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, yet sleep remained impossible. His phone buzzed with another message. This one came from Rebecca Lawson. Only 4 words. Check your email immediately. Marcus opened his laptop. A newly recovered document had just arrived. The subject line froze him in place. It was a confidential memorandum. Written 7 years earlier, signed personally by David Whitmore. And after reading the first paragraph, Marcus realized the investigation was about to become much larger than one police department, much larger than one town, potentially much larger than Kentucky itself. Marcus Reed spent nearly an hour staring at the confidential memorandum. The hotel room was silent except for distant traffic beyond the window. The document had been written 7 years earlier. Its contents were disturbing, not because of dramatic language, not because of explicit instructions, because of how carefully everything had been disguised. The memorandum discussed regional law enforcement cooperation, resource allocation, community engagement strategies, administrative oversight. Ordinary topics on the surface. Yet buried inside were recommendations that suddenly made the entire investigation look different. Marcus read one section 3 times, then a 4th. The meaning became impossible to ignore. Certain citizen complaints were being categorized differently. Certain investigations were being redirected. Certain patterns were intentionally overlooked. The language was subtle. The intent was not. This wasn't simply negligence. It suggested coordination. The next morning, Marcus returned to the federal field office. Every investigator had already reviewed the memorandum. The atmosphere inside the conference room was even more serious than before. Assistant Director Rebecca Lawson stood near a whiteboard covered with names. Departments, supervisors, dates, connections. The board had become a map, and the map revealed something troubling. "How many departments?" Marcus asked. Lawson exhaled slowly. "Potentially 6. The answer landed heavily. 1 department could claim failure. 6 departments suggested culture. Patterns, networks, systems protecting systems. Several investigators had spent the night comparing complaint records across multiple jurisdictions. The similarities were difficult to dismiss. Missing footage, dismissed complaints, incomplete reviews, repeated allegations involving the same supervisors, the same outcomes. Again and again, Marcus felt the weight of it. Every file represented a person, a family, a life disrupted. People often discussed civil rights violations using statistics. Statistics felt distant. These weren't statistics. These were human beings. At noon, federal prosecutors joined the investigation team. That alone signaled a major escalation. The evidence had moved beyond administrative concerns. Potential criminal exposure was now being discussed openly. Meanwhile, public pressure continued building. The story dominated national headlines. Community groups organized town hall meetings. Faith leaders called for transparency. Former officers began contacting investigators. Some requested anonymity. Others volunteered public testimony. A few admitted they had witnessed questionable practices for years. They simply never believed anyone would listen. Now someone finally was. Back in the Kentucky town where everything began, Maple House Cafe had become an unexpected symbol. People traveled from neighboring counties just to see it. Journalists interviewed customers. Residents debated the events endlessly. Some defended the officers. Others demanded accountability. Many struggled with a painful reality. The town they loved was not the town they imagined. Truth often worked that way. It challenged comforting stories. That afternoon, Emily Carter received a call from the University of Kentucky School of Law. One of the admissions counselors had seen her interview, seen her courage, seen her willingness to preserve evidence when others looked away. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, Emily sat silently behind the cafe counter. Her eyes filled with tears. For the first time, she began imagining a future she had never considered. A future fighting for justice instead of merely witnessing it. Across town, David Whitmore sat alone in his attorney's office. The commissioner looked exhausted, older, smaller somehow. The investigation had stripped away the certainty he carried for decades. Every new report made the situation worse. Every recovered email created another problem. Every witness added another piece. For the first time in his career, he found himself confronting a possibility he never truly considered. Accountability, real accountability. Not political inconvenience, not temporary embarrassment. Consequences. That evening, Marcus received another update. A federal judge had approved multiple subpoenas. Additional records would be released within days. The investigation was entering a new phase. A decisive phase. Marcus stood by the hotel window as sunset painted the Louisville skyline in shades of gold and crimson. His phone rang. It was Rebecca Lawson. Her voice sounded different, not concerned, not cautious, certain. "Marcus," she said, "we finally found the missing witness." Marcus straightened immediately. "The witness from the memorandum?" "Yes." A long pause followed. Then Lawson delivered the revelation. "And according to his statement, everything we've uncovered so far is only the beginning." Marcus looked toward the fading horizon. For days the investigation had seemed enormous. Now it was growing larger still, because somewhere out there was a witness carrying information powerful enough to change the entire case. And tomorrow, for the first time, that witness would speak publicly. The courthouse steps were already crowded when Marcus Reed arrived the next morning. Television cameras lined the sidewalk. Reporters filled every available space. Community leaders stood beside clergy members, attorneys, educators, and ordinary citizens who had followed the investigation from the beginning. The entire country seemed to be watching. For nearly 2 weeks, the story had dominated headlines. Now everyone wanted answers. Most importantly, they wanted truth. Assistant Director Rebecca Lawson stood near the entrance. Beside her was a man few people recognized. Middle-aged, nervous, quiet. His name was Daniel Mercer, and he had once worked inside one of the departments connected to the investigation. For years, he remained silent. For years, he convinced himself that speaking up would change nothing. Eventually, the guilt became heavier than the fear. When the press conference began, Mercer stepped forward. His hands shook slightly. His voice did not. For nearly 40 minutes, he described what he had witnessed. Complaint files redirected, internal investigations manipulated, evidence ignored, officers protected, victims discouraged, supervisors rewarded for maintaining silence. The crowd listened in complete stillness. Many reporters stopped taking notes. They simply stared. The testimony confirmed what investigators had suspected. The problem was never one officer, never one supervisor, never one town. The problem was a culture that treated accountability as a threat rather than a responsibility. By afternoon, federal prosecutors announced formal charges against multiple individuals connected to the investigation. Additional departments entered review. State officials launched independent audits. Oversight boards were created. Policies changed. Training standards were rewritten. For many families, justice arrived later than it should have. But it arrived. Months passed. Court proceedings continued. Evidence mounted. Witnesses testified. Facts prevailed. Eventually, verdicts followed. Several careers ended. Several officials lost positions they once believed were untouchable. Others faced criminal penalties. Most importantly, victims finally received acknowledgement. Their experiences were no longer dismissed. Their voices were no longer ignored. The truth had entered the record, and once truth enters the record, it becomes difficult to erase. Nearly a year later, Marcus returned to the small Kentucky town where everything began. It was another Saturday morning. The weather was warm. Sunlight filtered through the trees surrounding the town square. Children played near a fountain. Families strolled along the sidewalks. Life had moved forward. Marcus parked his car and walked toward Maple House Cafe. The bell above the door rang exactly as it had that first day. The familiar smell of coffee greeted him. So did Emily Carter. She was smiling. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Emily. Large coffee and a blueberry scone?" Marcus laughed. "You remembered. Some customers are hard to forget." She handed him the order, then shared her own news. She had been accepted into law school. She planned to focus on constitutional law and civil rights advocacy. Marcus felt genuine pride. One decision, one moment of courage, one person refusing to look away. Sometimes that was enough to change an entire life. He sat once again in the booth beside the window. The same booth, the same view. Yet everything felt different. Across the room sat families of every background. Students studied together. Neighbors talked freely. No place becomes perfect overnight. No community solves every problem. But progress begins when people choose honesty over comfort, responsibility over excuses, courage over silence. Marcus finished his coffee slowly. Before leaving, he glanced at a framed message hanging near the counter. It had been placed there after the investigation. The words were simple. "Justice begins when someone decides the truth matters more than fear." Marcus smiled, then he stepped outside into the sunshine. The town behind him continued moving forward. The road ahead stretched toward the horizon, and for the first time since that rainy Saturday morning, he felt at peace. Because the story was never really about one officer, or one town, or one investigation. It was about a choice. The choice every person faces when witnessing injustice. Look away, or stand up. History is shaped by those who choose the second option. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video.